The growing traditionalist-modernist divide. When the doughboys began to return from France at the war's end, the title of a popular song addressed a troubling question for many rural families. How are you going to keep them down on the farm after they've seen Perry? After experiencing bright city lights, many returning soldiers decided to leave their small hometowns behind. The 1920 census revealed a startling statistic for the first time ever. The U.S. population was more than 50% urban, a shift that set the stage for the growing divide between traditionalists and modernists. Urban attractions, economic opportunity, and personal freedom. Some 19 million people would move from farms to cities during the 1920s, largely in search of economic opportunities. Urban areas, with their factories and office buildings, were hubs of economic growth. As the economy boomed, the demand for workers increased, and wages rose as well. Between 1920 and 1929, the average per capita income rose 37%. Meanwhile, the Consumer Price Index, or the measure of the cost of basic necessities such as food and housing, remained steady, so urban wage earners saw their standard of living improve. Cities also offered the freedom to explore new ways of thinking and living. City dwellers could meet people from different cultures, go to movies, visit museums, and attend concerts. They could buy and read an endless variety of magazines and newspapers, and could drink, gamble, or go on casual dates without being judged as immoral. Rural problems, falling crop prices, and failing farms. The personal freedoms people experienced in cities stood in stark contrast to the stricter small-town life. In rural areas, most people lived in quiet communities and looked out for one another. They often regarded new ideas and ways of behaving with suspicion. Rural communities faced a host of problems during the 1920s. In addition to losing their younger generations to cities, farmers prospered during the war, producing food crops for the Allies and the home front. Enterprising farmers took out loans to purchase new machines or additional lands in hopes of increasing their output and profits. After the war, crop prices and European demand for U.S. farm products dropped sharply. With their incomes shrinking, numerous farmers were unable to repay their loans. In the early 1920s alone, hundreds of thousands of farmers lost their farms. For the rest of the decade, farmers' share of the national income dropped steadily, and by 1929, per capita income for farmers was less than half the national average. Congressmen from rural states attempted to reverse this downward slide by passing farm-friendly legislation. The most ambitious of these measures, the McNary-Hagan Bill, was first introduced in
Attention on campus. Joseph and Reyes, please come to attendance. Joseph and Reyes, please come to attendance.
Was first introduced in 1924, calling on the federal government to raise the price of some farm products by selling surplus crops overseas. Although Congress passed the bill twice in 1927 and 1928, President Calvin Coolidge vetoed it both times. The president was a strong opponent of the government's interference in markets, dismissing the McNary-Hagan Bill as preposterous. Changing values lead to mutual resentment. The divide between urban modernists and rural traditionalists was not only economic, as modernists generally viewed rural Americans as socially unadvanced. Sinclair Lewis, the first American writer to win the Nobel Prize for Literature, mocked small-town values. In one of his novels, he described the residents of a small Midwestern town as a savorless people, gulping tasteless food and sitting afterward, coatless and thoughtless in rocking chairs, prickly with inane decorations, listening to mechanical music, saying mechanical things about the excellence of Ford automobiles, and viewing themselves as the greatest race in the world. Not surprisingly, rural traditionalists resented these attacks on their behavior and values. They believed they were defending their virtues of American life, and viewed city culture as money-grubbing, materialistic, and immoral. At the same time, rural people could not help but envy the comforts and excitement city life seemed to offer. Defenders of traditional values often cited their faith and Bible to support their struggle against modernism. As a result, the 1920s saw a rise in religious fundamentalism, the idea that religious texts and beliefs should be taken literally and treated as the authority on appropriate behavior. Billy Sunday, a former Major League Baseball player, emerged as America's most prominent fundamentalist preacher. His dramatic preaching style drew huge crowds and he was said to have preached to more than 100 million people in his lifetime. Sunday's largest following was located in rural areas, including the South. As Sunday once remarked, there is 10 times more respect for God and the Bible and the Christian religion in the South than in any other part of the United States. Still, times were changing. A growing number of young modernists rejected long-accepted American values. Rural areas were losing residents to cities, and agriculture was no longer the backbone of the American economy. With mass media advancements, even rural people were being exposed to new ideas, music, and social values. Generations clash over the new youth culture. Before World War I, a young man interested in courting a young woman would first have to visit her home and meet her parents. If things went well, at this initial meeting, the boy would visit again, and if he invited the girl to a dance or a concert, an older adult would chaperone. Eventually, the girl's parents might trust the young couple enough to allow them to sit by themselves on the front porch. In traditional families, these courtship patterns continued after the war, but in more modern households, courtship changed dramatically, often confusing and upsetting older generations. Courtship customs were one way the older and younger generations clashed in the 1920s. The youth perspective. The old ways are repressive. Increasing demand for public education in the 1920s led to a majority of teenagers attending high school for the first time in U.S. history. College enrollment expanded as well, as young people spent more time than previously outside the home or workplace. A new youth culture emerged. It revolved around school, clubs, sports, music, dances, dating, movies, and trendy fads. For the most part, the fads young people followed were ephemeral. In one fad, young couples entered marathon dance competitions, where the last couple left standing after many hours of dancing won a prize. Flagpole sitting, in which participants spent days perched atop flagpoles, was another short-lived fad. One fad from the 1920s that remains popular today is the crossword puzzle. Most daring young women broke with tradition by becoming flappers. They colored their hair, cutting it short. Their skimpy dresses, worn without restrictive corsets, barely covered their knees. They rolled their stockings below their knees and sported unfastened rain boots. They flapped around their ankles. Flappers also wore makeup, which previously had been associated with loose or immoral women. Draped in beads and bracelets and carrying cigarette holders, they went to jazz clubs and danced the night away. In a magazine article discussing flappers, Zelda Fitzgerald wrote, "She flirted because it was fun to flirt, and wore a one-piece bathing suit because she had a good figure. She covered her face with paint and powder because she didn't need it, and she refused to be bored because she wasn't boring." Mothers disapproved of their sons taking the flapper to dances, to teas, to swim, and most of all to heart. Modern young couples traded old-fashioned courtship for dating. Whereas courtship was intended to lead to marriage, the purpose of dating was to have fun away from parents' prying eyes. Sedate tea parties and chaperone dances gave way to unsupervised parties. Many young people freely ignored the worries of their elders, who fretted about the younger generation's wild ways. After witnessing the war's waste of life, American youth determined that adults who had ordered young men into battle were not worthy of their respect. As one young person said, the older generation had certainly pretty well ruined this world before passing it on to us. Easy access to cars and mass media fueled youth rebellions. Cars provided young people a means to escape their elders' supervision. Meanwhile, magazines and movies spread positive rhetoric of youth culture, illustrating a world that differed greatly from their parents' time. Writers Ernest Hemingway and F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote about present-day youth in books with such titles as Beautiful and Damned. Perhaps no one better captured the feelings of rebellious youths than poet Edna St. Vincent Millais when she wrote, "My candle burns at both ends. It will not last the night. But ah, my foes, and oh, my friends, it gives a lovely light." Edna St. Vincent Millay. The adult perspective. Young people have lost their way. Many adults considered the behavior of young people reckless and immoral, and attempted to restore traditional morality in a number of ways. One method was censorship, as traditionalists removed books they deemed immoral from library shelves. They also pressured filmmakers to include fewer sexually suggestive scenes in movies. The Hayes Office, named for former Postmaster General Will Hayes, issued a movie code that banned prolonged kissing and positive portrayals of casual sex. Movie couples in bedroom scenes had to adhere to a 2 feet on the floor rule. Some states tried to legislate more conservative behavior. They passed laws to discourage women from wearing short skirts and skimpy swimsuits. Police with yardsticks patrolled beaches looking for offenders. Oftentimes, the older generation relied on loudly expressing their disapproval. When nagging their children was unsuccessful, many parents crossed their fingers and hoped rebellion was a passing phase. Many young people, even the most rebellious of flappers, eventually got married and chose to raise the next generation of rebellious youth. Wets and dries clash over prohibition. On February 14, 1929, men dressed in police uniforms raided the headquarters of Chicago's Moran gang. When the officers ordered the gangsters to raise their hands and line up against the wall, the gang members ignored them, as the police often bothered them to no avail. However, the police officers were actually disguised members of Al Scarface Capone's rival gang, who then drew their guns and fired at will. 7 members of the Moran gang died in what became known as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. This bloodbath was one of many unexpected consequences of what Herbert Hoover called an experiment noble in purpose, prohibition. The dry perspective. Prohibition improved society. Traditionalists and progressive reformers believed passing the 18th Amendment, which prohibited the manufacture, sale, or transport of alcoholic beverages, was a great victory. They pointed to the evidence of alcoholism, exacerbating crime, violence, and familial tensions. Dries, as prohibition supporters were known, believed that outlawing drinking would result in a healthier, happier society. Dries also viewed prohibition as a way of moderating city antics. Support for prohibition was largely centered in rural areas, where many Dries saw the 18th Amendment as a triumph of rural over urban Americans. As one Dry put it, prohibition allowed the pure stream of country sentiment and township morals to flush out the cesspools of cities. In addition, many traditionalists were suspicious of foreigners, associating beer and wine with immigrants of German and Italian descent, respectively. To these traditionalists, prohibition effectively curbed such foreign influences. At first, prohibition seemed to deliver on Dry's expectations. The national consumption of alcohol declined from an annual average of 2.6 gallons per capita before the war to less than 1 gallon by the 1930s. Fewer workers spent their wages at saloons to the benefit of their families. The greatest drinking decline probably occurred within groups that resented prohibition. The most: poor and working class ethnic people. To them, prohibition was another example of nativist prejudice toward immigrants. The wet perspective. Prohibition restricts freedom and breeds crime. Opponents of prohibition, or wets, were originally small in number, but grew as prohibition went into effect. Opposition centered mainly in large cities and immigrant communities. Many modernists opposed prohibition, criticizing it as an attempt by the federal government to legislate morality. Journalist H.L. Mencken, a champion of modernism, called Dries ignorant bumpkins of the cow states who resented the fact that they had to swill raw corn liquor, while city slickers got a good wine and whiskey. Another modernist, Massachusetts Senator David Walsh, rejected traditionalist claims that drinking was sinful. He reminded Dries that the first miracle performed by Jesus had been to turn water into wine. Were Jesus to perform this miracle in Prohibition-era America, Walsh observed, he would be jailed and possibly crucified again. Prohibition seemed doomed from the start. In October of 1919, Congress passed the Volstead Act to enforce the 18th Amendment. However, the federal government did not provide the enforcement agency the Prohibition Bureau with sufficient personnel, money, or supplies. Bureau agents were outnumbered by the millions of Americans clamoring for alcohol. Hoover later estimated that the government would need to employ 250,000 agents to fully enforce Prohibition. As a result, Prohibition law increased illegal activity by normally law-abiding citizens. Millions of Americans simply refused to abstain from drinking. Some learned how to brew their own bathtub gin, and others bought bootleg alcohol, which was either distilled illegally or smuggled from Canada. Even as thousands of bars and pubs were forced to close, they were replaced by nearly twice as many secret drinking clubs called speakeasies. The term speakeasy was derived from the practice of speaking quietly about the illegal saloons so as not to alert the police. A 1929 issue of the New York City's Variety boldly reported about 5 out of every 7 cigar stores, lunchrooms, and beauty parlors are speaks selling gin. The estimated number of speakeasies in New York City alone was 32,000. The widespread availability of illegal alcohol led the humorist Will Rogers to quip, "Prohibition is better than no liquor at all." The growing demand for liquor presented a golden opportunity to crooks like Al Capone. Bootlegging, the production, transport, and sale of illegal alcohol, became a multi-billion-dollar business by the mid-1920s. Chicago bootlegger Capone exhibited his wealth by driving a $30,000 Cadillac and flashing an 11.5-carat diamond ring. To continue driving profits without government interference. Capone bribed politicians, judges, and police officers, and also eliminated rival bootleggers. His 1,000-member gang was accredited with hundreds of murders. In 1931, Capone was sentenced to jail, not for bootlegging or murder, but for tax evasion. As lawlessness, violence, and corruption increased, support for Prohibition dwindled. By the late 1920s, many Americans believed that Prohibition had created more harm than good in society. In 1933, the states ratified the 21st Amendment, which repealed Prohibition. Modernists and traditionalists clash over evolution. In 1925, Dayton, Tennessee was a sleepy town of about 2,000 people, plus one free-thinking New York transplant named George Rapallia. That year, state legislature passed a law making it illegal for public schools to teach any theory that denies the story of the divine creation of man as taught in the Bible. While speaking with friends one day, Rapallia discussed an offer by the American Civil Liberties Union to defend any teacher who challenged the law. Rapallia had an epiphany. If they found such a teacher locally, the ensuing trial would not only demonstrate the foolish nature of the law, but would also attract national attention to Dayton. One of his friends knew the perfect candidate, a young science teacher named John Scopes, who would be willing to teach a lesson on evolution. The stage was set for a dramatic contest between modernists and traditionalists over the role of science and religion in public schools. The modernist perspective: science shows how nature works. Like many modernists, Rapallia looked to science rather than the Bible to explain how the physical world worked. Scientists accepted only facts and theories that could be tested and supported with evidence drawn from nature as true. By the 1920s, people could obscure the wonders of the modern science every time they turned on an electric light, listened to the radio, or visited their doctors. One of the most controversial scientific ideas of the era was the British naturalist Charles Darwin's theory of evolution. Darwin theorized that all plants and animals, including humans, had evolved from a simpler form of life. The evolution of one species from another occurred over thousands or millions of years, working through a process he named natural selection. Others called it survival of the fittest. In this process, species that make favorable adaptations to their environment are more likely to survive and reproduce than those that do not. As favorable adaptations spread, new species evolve from old ones. In this way, Darwin argued human beings had evolved from apes. Modernists embraced the theories of evolution and natural selection. Rather than choose between science and religion, they believed that both outlooks could coexist. "The day is past," declared a New York City preacher, "when you can ask thoughtful men to hold religion in one compartment of their minds and the modern world in another. By the 1920s, the theory of evolution was regularly taught in schools. Traditionalist perspective. The Bible is the Word of God. Traditionalists were more likely to consider science and religion in opposition. This was especially true of Christian fundamentalists, who believed the Bible was the literal Word of God. They rejected the theory of evolution because it conflicted with creationism, or the belief that God created the universe as described in the Bible. During the early 1920s, fundamentalists vigorously campaigned to ban teaching evolution in public schools and found a champion, William Jennings Bryan. A spellbinding speaker, Bryan had played a major role in American politics for 30 years, running for president 3 times and serving as Secretary of State under President Woodrow Wilson. Bryan toured the country, asserting that modernists had taken the Lord away from the schools. Bryan supported the creationist cause for 2 reasons. One was rooted in his deeply held Christian faith. The second was due to his fear that teaching evolution could lead young people to accept social Darwinism, the belief that, as in nature, only the fittest members of a society will survive. Social Darwinism had been used to justify imperialism, in that the fittest or the most powerful peoples should rule over the less powerful. People had also employed it to promote eugenics, or the belief that the human species should be improved by forbidding people with characteristics judged undesirable to reproduce. Bryan believed such views threatened the poor and weak, and worried that widespread acceptance of social Darwinism and eugenics would weaken the cause of democracy and strengthen class pride and power of wealth. Creationism versus evolution in Tennessee. Tennessee became the first state to enact a law that banned teaching evolution in public schools, which may not have caused a nationwide stir if Rapalea had not contested it. He sent a student to pull Scopes off a tennis court and said, "John, we've been arguing, and I said that nobody could teach biology without teaching evolution." Not only did Scopes agree, but he also volunteered to teach a lesson on evolution the next day. Rapalea then asked the American Civil Liberties Union to defend the young science teacher before going to the police to have Scopes arrested. The Scopes trial, which began on July 10, 1925, drew far more attention to Dayton and Rapalea, than Rapalea had anticipated. Bryan offered to represent the state of Tennessee, while Scopes supporters appointed high-power lawyer Clarence Darrow to his defense. Although Darrow had supported Bryan for president, they disagreed. On religious matters, so he agreed to defend Scopes for free. Some 200 reporters arrived in Dayton as the trial began, along with tourists and hawkers selling toy monkeys. The whole country was following the battle between creationism and evolution. In their opening statements, both lawyers acknowledged that the deciding issue concerned more than whether Scopes had broken the law. If evolution wins, Bryan had warned, Christianity goes. Darrow argued, Scopes isn't on trial, civilization is on trial. To help support his argument, Darrow brought a variety of experts to Dayton to testify against the Tennessee law. The judge dismissed the experts after only one testified because their testimony was deemed irrelevant to the guilt or innocence of the science teacher. For a moment, it seemed as though Darrow had no defense, but he then surprised everyone at the trial by calling Bryan to the stand as an expert on the Bible. "Do you claim that everything in the Bible should be literally interpreted?" Darrow asked. Bryan answered, "I believe everything in the Bible should be accepted as it is given there." However, when questioned about whether Earth had actually been created in 6 days, Bryan answered, "I do not think it means necessarily a 24-hour day. Creation," he added, "might have continued for millions of years." Darrow was able to trick Bryan, the fundamentalist champion, into admitting that he himself did not necessarily interpret every word of the Bible as the literal truth. At the conclusion of the Scopes trial, the jury took fewer than 10 minutes to determine that Scopes was guilty, whereupon the judge fined him $100. However, the Tennessee Supreme Court overturned the conviction a year later on the grounds that it was the judge, not the jury, who had imposed the monetary fine on scopes. Culturally, the United States became a deeply divided nation during the Roaring Twenties. Tensions arose between traditionalists with their deep respect for long-held cultural and religious values and modernists who embraced new ideas, styles, and social trends. Urban versus rural. By 1920, the United States was becoming more urban than rural. Urban areas prospered as business and industry boomed. Meanwhile, rural areas declined in population and economic prosperity. Youth versus adults. Suspicious of older generations after the war, many young people rejected traditional values and embraced a new youth culture. Chaperoned courting gave way to unsupervised dating. Flappers scandalized the older generation with their style, dress, as well as their drinking. Wets versus dries, religion versus science.